Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Nelson. I'm the VP of Marketing at Valora Technologies. I'd like to welcome everyone today to our final session of Valora's Universal Auto Classification Masterclass webinar series. Given we're coming to the end of our 2019 session, we thought what a great idea to close out this decade than looking ahead at 2020. And we've got four folks on the line today who better to share their expertise and their thoughts than folks from information governance, privacy security, business transformation, and emerging technologies. And together they're going to discuss industry trends, the impact and effort of some of the changes that we're going to talk about best practices on ways to implement, maintain, and expand enterprise IG strategies as a whole. So let's introduce our speakers today. So first up, from the IG side of things, and his perspective, we've got Steve Wiseman, who is the InfoGov guy from Holly Group, and he spent his career in IG and IM, and now helps businesses with their IG strategies. On the data privacy and security side, we've got Antigone Payton, who is an IP and technology lawyer and CEO and founder at Clatterjee Law. So welcome, Antigone. Representing business transformation, we have Kate Pugh, who's both a faculty member of the Columbia University Information and Knowledge Strategy Master of Science program, and is also president and author from Align Consulting. And last but certainly not least, we have our own Sandy Serkis, who is CEO and founder of Valora Technologies. So welcome all of you today. We're pretty excited to get started. A format for our audience today: each of our experts is going to have a top 5 predictions for 2020. They're going to go through them, and we're going to have an open discussion. And again, if you have any questions as we go, please do not hesitate to ask them. So without further ado, Steve, over to you.
That's great. Thanks so much. Just so you know, technical difficulties. My screen doesn't seem to be advancing as you push buttons, assuming you are pushing buttons.
Oh, I am.
Okay, so I'm going to assume my 5 bullets are on the screen right now, or the first of the 5.
Mm-hmm.
And as it says there, this phrase was co-opted by a former coach of the Boston Celtics, who said, as the team was struggling, Larry Bird ain't walking through that door. So my first postulation here is artificial intelligence ain't walking through that door. And the more I looked at so-called AI-based InfoGov applications, the more I realized it's not anywhere yet, really, in practice. And looking ahead a year, 2, maybe 3, I don't see it really playing a role at all. So if that strikes you as controversial, then my job here is done. If you were to substitute machine learning for artificial intelligence, then we got something to talk about. But if you're waiting for AI to come solve all your problems, I think you're going to wait a really long time. So that's number 1. Number 2,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like David Letterman, top 10 list. Blockchain is beautiful, but it's not a perfect 10. But blockchain is another one of these technologies like AI that you hear about all the time. And maybe unlike AI, I think it was Mark Twain who talked about the weather. Everybody talks about it. Nobody does anything about it. There are people doing some things with blockchain. It's a really great solution if you have the kind of application that requires that kind of relative immutability. But I put the word relative in front of immutability because, unlike its original reputation, it's not unhackable. So there's a lesson there in that there is no silver bullet for any of this stuff. So if you're waiting for one, just like AI, you're going to wait a really long time. But blockchain is an elegant solution for a lot of applications. So I expect we're going to see more of that in the next several years, especially next. Oh, look, my screen just advanced. Okay, number 3. See, it works. Thank you for laughing. We'll be here all week. Okay, the third prediction is more of a true prediction. And it's one I've been waiting for a really long time. And it's this notion that search finally becomes find. I used to say it just to be sort of snarky, and I'm talking about used to like 15, 20 years ago, because our objective has never been to search for things. It's been to find them. And you want to find them because you want to do something with whatever the information is that you're looking for. So dealing with clients for years, I've always set the expectation right up front. Let's talk find. Let's talk about find engines. And it sounded really goofy, but today we're on the precipice of having that actually be the case. It's the gateway to doing information right in terms of metadata and classification and ultimately business intelligence in various forms. Because for me, that's the reason for this season, as they would say at this time of year, I guess. You know, you collect all this information not just to have it. I mean, some organizations are information hoarders, to be sure, but really you want to do something with it, whether it's to protect yourself against an audit, you know, something's gone wrong and you have fines, or you're looking for patterns to boost your sales or shorten time to product development. There's a business reason. And if you look at these quote unquote search engines dominating conversations today, finally they are really starting to reek of find engines. And yay, it's about time. Number 4, privacy puts pressure on policies and practices. I hit on this style for a headline if you remember the movie Mr. Popper's Penguins with Jim Carrey, which nobody ever heard of, but was pretty fun. And they had a woman who could only speak in plosives. Somebody snickered. Thank you for that. A lot of times in a lot of different technology areas or business practices, there are catalysts that really spark investment and spark growth in those areas and spark visibility. In the early days of the personal computer, it was the spreadsheet. That gave people a reason to buy computers because it was so clear that they could do what-if analyses so much faster on the PC than having to do it on paper, which is how they had to do it originally. In terms of InfoGov, I think privacy leads the pack in that regard. You know, GDPR was a start. Unfortunately, in my view, in this country, it got overlooked because, well, we're not in the EU, regardless of whether or not it applied because universities had students or commercial enterprises had customers that were EU citizens. But now there's CCPA in California, and New York's getting a law, and it's like Oprah, right? Everybody gets a law. So I think 2020 will be one of those inflection points in the curve driven by privacy. Organizations are going to have to get really serious about what policies they have in place, because many don't even have a coherent policy, and what practices they're going to install to support those policies. You know, time is now. The time is 2020, and I definitely see that happening. And then the last but not least, I think I'll not wait for my screen to refresh. Risk joins the conversation. This is something that I've noticed relatively recently, and I had a very interesting discussion with, I don't do him justice, but I call him an integrator type, about the role business risk plays as you're arguing your InfoGov case versus the value, the business value that can accrue by doing InfoGov right. The consensus, I did a video on this recently, so plug for myself, sorry, shameless. It does seem that making the business value argument may be the shortest route to, let's say, senior management support. But I like the fact that I began to hear people talk about business risk. We all know that there's risks involved by not doing information right. But it's another thing that I felt like people just didn't want to talk about. It's too scary, too much like trying to convince somebody to buy insurance just in case. But it's appropriate that it's there, and I expect to see more conversation about risk going forward. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Cool. Steve, we've got a question from the audience here. What is your prediction for the role of ECM systems in 2020? And a little side note, thanks for an entertaining and informative presentation.
Oh, and this is going to sound self-serving because I heard that part, but it bleeped at the beginning of the
At the
note.
beginning of the, so what is your prediction for the role of ECM systems in 2020?
What's the freedom's just another word for nothing less to lose. It's a song lyric. ECM's just another word for infogov with all to gain. How's that for a stretch? I look at ECM, I look at BPM, I look at KM, all the M's as being different flavors of information governance.
Mm-hmm.
Done right, they all have the same objectives at heart, and it's what I like to call the care and feeding of business critical information. So one of the first things that I do is I try to get the vocabulary off the table right away. We're going to talk about managing stuff, and we want to be aware of all the technology choices in front of us. But personally, I don't much care what they're called. I want to know what they do and how well they solve the problem. So ECM certainly has a role. It's not going away. But it almost doesn't matter what you call it.
Awesome. Okay. Any comments from the rest of the panelists on Steve's top 5 here?
Well, this is Kate. Oops, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Kate. I'll follow up.
That was Antigone, and this is Kate. And I am thrilled that you're talking about what we call findability in the knowledge space. As people know, I'm sort of coming from the KM, one of those wonderful M's. And I really like the fact that we're seeing organizations not saying either or, we have to go and get a search tool, or we have to work on information governance. They're realizing that they need both, and that they need to have a bird's eye view of their content to tell the kinds of stories around both risk and opportunity. So thanks for bringing find in, and I'll echo you when I come up.
Cool. That's why we get along. Thank you.
So just to add on the conversation, it's interesting because in my practice and given the businesses that I work with, in terms of use and integration of technology, some of those businesses are on the front of the adoption curve. So I want to talk a little bit about 1, 2, and 5 on this list when we talk about that adoption curve. I think that Steve is right in the sense that AI ain't walking through the door with a lot of traditional companies, though I do see some adoption of AI primarily around recruiting through the use of AI in third-party platforms. Blockchain is something that a lot of companies are looking at in terms of helping to protect their data or potentially engaging in real-time transaction recordation. But again, that's the front of the curve. Machine learning, though, as he mentioned, is an area that I'm seeing a lot of really interesting business activity, including companies that are now playing with machine learning to do things like develop software code, develop real products that go out in the marketplace. And so I'm seeing a lot of AI use and machine learning use in particular as a subdiscipline under AI with respect to business development. Now, once businesses start using AI as part of their operational practice, they of course need to think about the information governance piece. So I would say that generally it's more of a focus these days on use of machine learning to solve business problems or deal with technology development differently. They're going to have to start thinking about what that means in terms of their information governance impact. And then finally, the point about risk. Business risk management is a term that some of the companies that I work with talk about all the time. And it is part of the high-level conversations relating to lots of things they do that range from deciding whether to bring another third-party vendor in to hold a sensitive set of data, to how they engage in procurement and logistics activities relating to purchase and shipment of products. So that term is becoming a real business term, and it's used in a wide variety of contexts, but it's this idea of operational awareness, and it touches on information governance, privacy, cybersecurity, and many other business concepts.
I'll jump in. This is Sandy with one more thought, particularly about number 5. I laughed when I heard Steve say this, because coming from an e-discovery background and records, I would almost argue the opposite, that finally business value is joining the conversation. And I think that what that reflects is just a point of view, and the fact that these historically disparate groups are now actually coming together, that legal and records are saying the same thing, and cybersecurity is joining, and IT. Who's the latecomer to the party is really a question of perspective. Legal would say business value is the newcomer, and I think where Steve's covered information governance would say risk is the newcomer. So I think the bigger meta point is that everyone is starting to join forces, which is really the right thing for information governance.
I feel like I'm on the debate stage. Can I respond to that? Actually, Sandy, what you raise an interesting perspective, because obviously a lot of our different, what do we see in 2020 answers reflect, I would imagine, the bulk of the nature of the clients that we serve. In e-discovery terms, in legal terms, yeah, no, you're exactly right. A lot of what I do comes more out of, if you will, the records management end of the world, where business risk, if it's defined at all, is pretty narrow. And so I spend a lot of time trying to explain that continuity of operations kinds of things, and which is very dependent on information, of course. So as is so often the case, I do think for all you folks out there tuning in, and thank you for doing so, you have to kind of translate all of our thoughts into the context that you're operating in, of knowing the people and the personalities and the priorities of the folks that you have to convince higher up and get support from elsewhere in the organization. And it essentially becomes almost a marketing enterprise to use their language to make your case.
Interesting. Cool. Why don't we move on to Antigone? Antigone's top 5 predictions for data privacy and security.
Sure. So just to set the stage, Steve alluded to a lot of activity in the privacy space in the United States in particular. So as many people know, the General Data Protection Regulation was a thing in 2016. May 2018 is when it became enforceable. And so there was a big scramble around that time for companies that believed that they were subject to the obligation to be compliant with GDPR. They tried to get their head around what they do and how they do it. There were many businesses, frankly, in the United States who had obligations under GDPR, but decided that they were not going to comply for a variety of reasons, whether it's the risk structure is low, or they thought they weren't a big enough fish for a regulator to go after, or there were other reasons why they decided they could interpret the law differently. So as we fast forward to late 2019, privacy is now a big deal in the United States. Not only do we have Congress looking at it on the federal level, but we've got at least 15 states that are actively playing around with legislation, and we have several that have enacted legislation, including California and Nevada, where we have to deal with that here and now. And California in particular is quite comprehensive and a little bit different than GDPR in several ways that matter. So as companies think about how they operationalize a privacy and cybersecurity program, they need to think about this issue holistically, because most human beings can't figure out 15 different ways to go about something based upon the state you're in or the consumer that you're dealing with. This is just not a reasonable way to try to operationalize a privacy and cybersecurity program. So as we think about operationalizing these from a holistic perspective for a business, there are a few critical pieces that I want to focus on. And these are my top 5 predictions in terms of companies becoming more sophisticated as they roll out and mature these programs. So the first one is current data maps. Current is an important word. I don't mean a data map from 2 years ago that somebody put together when they had a litigation and they had to find stuff. I mean a living, breathing data map that gets updated as soon as there's a new system procurement request where people are analyzing whether that's an appropriate system to bring on board and then reflecting that within their data mapping tool or their other policy documentation. This is really the foundation for a proper information governance program, and it's absolutely critical for both privacy and cybersecurity. So if an incident happens, like a consumer request comes in under California law, the people who are tasked with responding to that request in the mandated time period can then go deal with the right systems that have the relevant data and respond appropriately to that request. But if you don't know what you have and you don't know where it is and you don't know how to get it out or how to interrogate that system, you're going to be in a whole world of hurt when you try to start to comply with these laws. The second piece I want to bring in is this metaphysical question about how we deal with our data systems. And this is one that companies that I've worked with are really struggling with, right? So you might think that it makes sense to put a whole lot of data in a small number of systems. But that particular decision has significant ramifications in terms of both cybersecurity and privacy. Cybersecurity, an easy thing to think about is if that system is compromised, if you have a human who does the wrong thing and somebody gets into the system, you've given them the keys to the kingdom relating to a wide variety of data that's very sensitive from a company perspective. Likewise, for privacy purposes, particularly under the European law, when you start to aggregate data coming from different sources and build profiles on individuals, that's quite problematic and frowned on under European law. It may help you in terms of responding, let's say, to a California consumer request because you've got most of the stuff in one system. But these are the types of considerations that companies need to undertake when they're thinking about what they're putting their data in and what's being combined or separated. Moving on to the next item, less information, less hassle. So many companies for a long period of time have said, you know what, we keep everything so when we need it, we can get back to it. That's a real problem when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy. We need to adopt more thoughtful approaches on how to deal with these issues. If you don't have a whole lot of extraneous data that's not there beyond its business need life, or beyond the required period for you to legally keep that record, seriously consider deleting it. Now that, of course, should be consistent with any record retention policy that you've applied to that document type. But if it's not there, you don't have to worry about breaches, and you don't have to worry about getting that data out and giving it to somebody when you receive a request for the information that the company is holding on a particular individual under any law. I will also note that under European law, there's this data minimization principle that's very important. So that old way of thinking, save everything and then we can get to it if we need it, and data storage is cheap, so we shouldn't worry about it. Companies are coming full circle and saying, you know what, we need to be more intelligent about what we're keeping, where we're keeping it, and whether we combine it or keep it in separate places. So moving on to number 4, education, education, education. This is so critical to support a mature privacy and cybersecurity program. If people don't understand what phishing emails look like, if they don't understand how to hover over a hyperlink to see where it actually goes, if they don't understand how to check the email address associated with a particular name in the header, they're really easy vectors for somebody to get into the system and do bad things. So that's very critical from a cybersecurity perspective. In terms of privacy, one of the things that I'm seeing is a lot of education of employees about the basic principles relating to privacy obligations, and then different types of education based upon their role within the organization. So for instance, people who are at a high level, who have access to a wide variety of information, or they're within a business unit that deals with a lot of individual information. Think HR and payroll, for instance. Or think about a marketing team that's collecting a lot of information about the consumers they interact with on social media platforms, or they have a ticket intake for consumer request relating to shipments that went wrong, right? These are the people who need a higher level of education. As to the people who are dealing with money transfer and other situations where they might get access to very sensitive information that could be responsive to some of these privacy obligations. But if you have field people who are at a lower level, they don't have wide access to major systems, but they need just a basic understanding. Often a lower level set of education around the principles and how they engage in good corporate information governance and what their obligations are with respect to data can suffice. So I'm seeing variation in how this training occurs based upon the organizational activities. I'm seeing more businesses move to online platforms to automate that process, to verify that somebody has taken that education, and then testing to verify that they understand what they've learned and are able to apply it effectively in practice. And then last but not least, it takes a village. So let's not pretend that any one person has the skill set to effectively roll out and manage and continue to refresh an information governance program. This is something where I see a lot of companies bringing together a working group or creating a subgroup within the organization to help manage this. And each of those stakeholders have different areas of expertise and different operational responsibilities within the organization. Often it involves people from the information technology group, including information architects who understand the data flow and how these systems are connected. We see records managers if the company has a record management function that's separate from their legal compliance function. Places like HR and payroll, again, dealing with very sensitive information on a regular basis. Others within the financial group, and then groups like marketing. Now, you might wonder why marketing? Well, this is very important from a privacy perspective because laws like the California law are very focused on the do not sell obligation and the do not track, as well as getting access to consumer information. And often marketing has developed or brought on significant analytics tools to help them better act with their consumer base or potential customers. But unwittingly, they have collected a significant amount of data that could be responsive to some of these requests. So it's important to get them in the room and bring them in as part of this process. So these are my top 5 predictions for what data security and privacy will look like as these programs move forward.
Very important. I'll open it to the floor now. Any comments from the rest of the panelists?
Well, this is Kate once again, and Antigone. Amen. This is really exciting that you've put this together. I wouldn't say it's exciting because it's challenging for us to really enact the things that you're prescribing there. The one thing that I would probably say is happening is the knowledge management community that is on the line right now is probably quaking because they're saying to themselves, oh no, less information, less hassle. And I would submit to you that this puts out an important and relevant challenge to the KMers to create some kind of relevant abstraction of the content. We don't need to keep all of the individual records. We need to be able to have lessons learned. We need to be able to have insights that are higher level than those discoverable data. And I challenge the KMers in the community to think intelligently about not just simply retiring content, but making sense of it.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. So one of the conversations that we're having with organizations is around when it's appropriate to get to that population level data analytics side and anonymize or pseudonymize the underlying records. And how quickly can we get there?
Exactly. We can use a story from the past. We don't necessarily need to see all the individual records.
Right.
This is Sandy. I will pop in with one very timely thing. Just this morning, a report was published by Kate's former employer, Ernst & Young, about consumer attitudes towards data privacy, particularly in the United States. What we hear a lot on the business side is, it's kind of a European thing. Yeah, there's CCPA, but this sort of kind of dragging of feet happening in the United States. And the EY study makes it crystal clear. It was something like 40% of Americans are extremely concerned about data privacy, to the point where they are essentially opting out, not officially, but just by their actions, to providing information even to trusted websites. Just as an anecdotal version of this, we were in a store and, they wanted to give, I was there with my daughter who's a college sophomore. They wanted to give some sort of special deal, asked her for her email address, which is just a university email address. And my smart cookie daughter turned around and said, "Why do you need that information?" So I just mentioned that this notion of what belongs to you and how is it going to be used is trickling down and about everywhere. It's showing up everywhere, and kind of dragging our feet as American business is not a good long-term strategy.
Oh, I have so many things I want to add, but we only have an hour. Okay, well, I'll stick to Antigone's points for now. That's the idea, and at the risk of sounding like everybody else, yay you. But I made 3 notes in particular for myself, and in looking at them, I realized they come down to the same thing. And in particular, it's when you started talking about all the things that sort of regular people don't know, the need for education. And I laughed when you wrote "It Takes a Village." Sandy may remember this. A couple of years ago, the Information Coalition, of which I was a founder, it's now part of ARMA, we were doing a live virtual conference, and somebody said it takes a village, and I couldn't help it, and I just said, well, every village has one, But it relates because, you talked about education. One of the other things you said that I really resonated to, dovetails perfectly with my own philosophy for years, is this notion of holism. And what I realized is they fit because the education, the knowledge that we have to impart, the brainwashing that we have to do so often relates to all of these, because there are, I say this in a jocular fashion, the village idiots, they don't have that knowledge. It's true ignorance. It's not stupidity. It's ignorance. They haven't learned, haven't been exposed to why all this makes sense, so they don't necessarily think about it. And to think about it holistically, it's all the departments, it's all the business stuff. It's, where I sit, it's let's stop distinguishing, except when it comes to the tools, let's stop distinguishing between, what's content versus information versus data, images. I mean, there are differences, but the philosophy is a holistic one. It's what stuff is there to be managed, and how do we best manage it according to what it is. So the other, education, yes, the flip side of that is marketing. It's a PR and marketing campaign often within organizations to get them on board, to make it less scary, to have them feel like at the end of the day, this is being done for them, not to them, which is a very common sensibility I run into. That, no, this is actually going to help you do your job too. Imagine being able to find something at the click of a button. I'll just tie up the comment with a real life anecdote in a city government. Somebody said, I look for that file for 15 minutes, and when I can't find it, I call Jolene. And it's not Jolene's job, but she had built herself a ridiculous but effective Excel spreadsheet. And at the end of the drill down was a link to a PDF, and she knew where everything was, but nobody else did. So when you point that out to these people, that this is something that will help you, it can be really eye-opening. Nobody ever took the time to explain it. So yeah, education.
Yeah. Excellent. We're just over halfway through our hour here, so we're going to move on. Kate is going to give her top 5 predictions for business transformation.
Thank you very much, Jen. So I guess my top line is, I'm going to teach you to sell this. I'm going to go through a number of different areas in your organization where people might furrow their brows and be interested in saying, why should I be interested in information governance? So let's talk about markets first. I think the big headline here is disruption. And by the way, so therefore you should be a disruptor. And the only way you're going to be able to be a disruptor is for you to be able to tell the story, have your house in order, and be able to see what kind of bird's eye view you can for your information. So we're going to be seeing potentially a contraction. There should be a lot more M&A going on in 2020. There will be new business models, and we're going to also be now working a lot more with different generations. We already know we have 5 generations in the marketplace, but Gen Y is going to come out loud and strong, and they're going to be smart cookies, as we just heard from Sandy. They're going to be very decisive about what kind of information they want to give, they want to consume, and how you interact with them, which leads us right there next to customers. The next item here is customers. So the headline here is that your whole business matters. It's not just the product that you happen to put up on your website or put on your shelf. People are now interested in a variety of different capabilities and representations. They want to know that you have a lower carbon footprint. They want to know that your service is clean and delivered immaculately. They want to know that you have ways of protecting their data. They want to know that you have a highly ethical core. And your reputation is going to be that which they buy and that which you could lose. So the headline there again is that it's the whole business, not just your customer's immediate product. Now with operations and IT, what's interesting here is that we have this trend that is going to continue into 2020, which I call bring your own app. And we had bring your own device, and I think we're all kind of wringing our hands over bring your own device. That's old news. Now the deal is any department can acquire a cloud application. And what's going to happen is we're going to see a lot of replication of data. We're going to see a lot of replication of some of the mining of data. And we'll have a number of stories that people are trying to tell from little piecemeal information. And until we start having somebody put their foot down and say, we can't keep on acquiring these applications which don't talk to each other, we're going to continue to, see this recklessness. So when you see the final click and Jen reveals all of our pluses and minuses, you're going to see that's the one area where I'm wringing my hands because I do a lot of interactions with ops and IT. Now, when we look at HR, legal, and finance, the headline is the data. It's all about where we can use data to improve the way we hire, to improve the way we administer benefits, improve the way we recognize people and do succession planning. In the legal space, it's about how we are managing all of our accounts. It's about how we're managing and modeling risk. In the financial area, it's about how we're managing cash. Data is gold. And I should probably say data are gold. We know data is plural there. And it is really, really important for us to see that when these organizations turn to this story about data, they care very, very deeply about the related risk. So we heard that from Steve. We heard that from Antigone. We're going to hear that from Sandy in a moment. They are leading the charge with information governance because they have a risk story. But what's happening is that people are looking over their shoulder and they're saying, no, I'm also telling a story about value. I'm telling a story about improving the relationship with customers, improving our positioning and our new business models. So thank you, HR, legal, finance, for taking us to this spot and for letting us also overlay it with these other benefits. Finally, engineering. So the headline here is that everything is agile. Everywhere I look, I hear about sprints and epics and stories, and it's really exciting, and I'm loving the fact that this is incredibly collaborative in principle, but we actually are seeing quite a bit of fragmentation because you're seeing different teams kind of focusing locally on their, quote, self-directed story or this self-directed epic. So that does present some major risk. And so engineering organizations are stepping back and saying, wait a minute, our product lifecycle management processes are at risk. Our ability to show the documentation over time of our products is getting worse. We need to be able to stand back and look at the product over time. So if you click one more time, you can see where we are, and you can see for operations and IT, I wouldn't say that we are decreasing our information governance, but we are increasing our data, and it's more at risk. So there's my 5, and I stand by them.
Well done. And open the floor to the rest of our panelists for comments on these top 5.
See, I'm an optimist. And Kate and I talked about this ahead of time a little bit, in fact. So besides saying yay again, I want to say I disagree. It's not a capital letter D disagree. But one of the things that we talked about was the minus sign next to operations and IT. And when I say I'm an optimist, what I mean is I agree, Kate, with your premise that this area is growing in importance and requires a different sort of depth of commitment to making sense of it. But the optimist in me says, no, that's a great opportunity for InfoGov. I think probably from a practical perspective, you're right, that when we look back on it, it may well be a minus sign there. But in my head, it's a plus. It's a single plus rather than a single minus. I think we're talking about small differences in degree.
We need leadership. I think what you're saying is that we're both optimistic that there will be some leaders that will stand back. You know, this is C-level material, everybody. And that's why you can have some pretty compelling conversations and you can sell this.
Thank you for articulating what's in my head, and I'll get out of my head.
Awesome. Okay, well, next we've got Sandy, who's going to give us her top 5 predictions for emerging technologies.
Okay, it's fun to go last here because so much of what has been said, I would echo. I was once part of an organization where when you agreed with the person, you were supposed to snap, and the more snaps that you heard, the more agreement that was in the room. So even though I've been on mute, I've been snapping all over the place here. And so as I move into the predictions for emerging technologies, of course, I'm going to talk about auto classification because although I might argue it's not exactly emerging anymore. I mean, it's always growing and changing and progressing, but the whole point, I think what we're going to see in 2020 and beyond is that auto classification is really growing up. And what I mean by that is a combination of what it is and a combination of the people using it becoming comfortable with the technology. When we first started out with this type of approach, many people were frightened of software doing the work for them, distrustful, and in some cases hostile. And that has really, really changed to the point where people are now really embracing the ability to automate in general and to have technology take on tedious, stupid work that they weren't really doing a good job with manually anyway. So what we're going to see is this kind of broad acceptance and happiness about auto classification, and the technologies now have been through enough pilots and implementations and doc types and different types of information governance rulemaking that they're pretty solid at this point. So coming together, that makes for a pretty powerful equation. And so I think you're going to see a change from kind of simplistic early attempts at auto classification into the full-on, what I've been talking about, frankly, all year, this notion of cohesive, holistic data under management. Number 2, there is going to continue to be an ever greater proliferation of content. The same V's that we used to talk about, variety, veracity, volume, etc., those are still very much in play. What's starting to change, and Kate just mentioned this with her BYOA, It's BYO, maybe E for everything. And so everything is becoming a form of content, and it's everywhere. It's in the cloud, it's on-prem, it's in your phone, it's video, it's audio. This very webinar is being recorded. And so the IG task gets more and more complex and distributed, which is something that Antigone mentioned about whether to consolidate or distribute content. And so what we know is more is more is more in every direction. And the idea that, oh, now we'll be able to streamline, I think is almost a lost cause in 2020. And so that brings those two together, kind of bring us to this notion of ROI, return on investment, or whether you want to call it value. Basically, what's happening is that because there's widespread adoption and because the technology is maturing, and in fact the users themselves are maturing, the cost to implement and utilize and run these kinds of systems is coming down. And so that helps with the kind of denominator of the value equation. At the same time, the more content that's out there, the more applications being subject to it, the more regulation is increasing the benefit of getting your content under control. So the kind of cost-benefit equation, which really should be called the benefit over cost equation, that's sort of how the math works, is getting more and more palatable every day. And I think Steve may have mentioned this. In 2020, we're going to cross that ROI point where it makes sense kind of here on out. And that dovetails very nicely. Kate mentioned this one as well. Again, you see, by the way, we all developed our 5 points in our own world, and then we came together. So it was sort of fascinating where all the overlap is, and that's what we're going to talk about next. But I agree that I think M&A is going to be healthy in 2020. M&A has been on a huge tear in the last 3 or 4 years, and every time that there is an M&A activity, there's going to be acquisition of content, obligation, and risk, which means again, here we go with that equation, ever more continued influx of content and responsibility. And so the risk parties are the ones kind of taking the lead, legal, finance, HR, and kind of joining and in some ways driving the information governance party. And then finally, thank you to Kate for mentioning this one. Everywhere I turn, I hear the phrase business transformation or digital transformation. I don't know if it's something magical about the year 2020, which has kind of harkens back to the idea of perfect vision. But every organization is talking about 2020 being the year that they begin their transformation initiatives. And that, again, is going to drive looking at technology, adoption of technology, and this is happening so fast. That note about being agile is transcending software development and going into general business transformation. So we are just seeing transformation at a pace that, frankly, as human beings, we're not even used to yet. And so the software is starting to take over the actual transformation. That's AI, just to bring it back to what Steve was saying. So these are my 5 predictions, and as Kate said, I'm sticking by them.
Well
I don't
done.
know if anyone wants to react to them.
I was just going to say.
We're all being polite. Well, I'll react. It's a clean sweep of yay you here. But one of the things that was going through my mind as you were going down your list, especially the last one, I'm trying to find the beginning of this thought now. There are a lot of organizations out there for which all the things we've been talking about is enormously frightening. They look at the headlines in the business trades and they read about other companies that are doing these things. We all have clients that are predisposed towards thinking this way. That's how they end up raising their hands to become clients. But if you're tuned into this and you're not as far along the curve, or you're just kicking tires because you know something's happening and you're trying to figure out what and how it relates to you, I just wanted to jump in and add it's okay. You know, the reason that these things are in the headlines is because they're new. By definition, they're news. A good portion of the world is not anywhere near actualizing these things. But you're smart for tuning into them because they are out there. They are going to affect your operations at some point in the future. And it's really good to know what's headed your way before you actually encounter it, and then you're prepared. So it isn't so much a direct point-by-point rebuttal or support of what Sandy and everyone else has said, but it dawned on me that it might be a comfort of sorts to some people to know it's okay. You know, you're getting there, and the fact that you're not maybe fully there yet is really fine.
Yeah, just to add on Steve's comment a little bit, the thing that I always tell companies that they get overwhelmed by everything that we discuss, right? And let's be frank, it is a lot of information. I describe it as eating the elephant a bite at a time. So we're going to focus on the low-hanging fruit with high impact in terms of reduction of business risk and start there. And we're going to create a timeline to go from there to the next point. And let's be frank, going back to the agile point, we need to be reactive. We can't set out the plan for 5 years now because we don't know what's going to happen 5 years in the future. So we do need to have a very agile, reactive way of dealing with this, identifying the high risk, high reward options or tasks that are step one, and then move forward from there. And I find that helps the business people get a better comfort level with the fact that they're seeing progress, they're making progress, but they're starting to operationalize some of the aspirations.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We've got about 5 minutes left we're just coming up to the top of the hour here. Now our panelists, when they all kind of went away and did their top five, we kind of came together and did a top five, I turned into an actual top six. You know, the differences between where we've seen things come in the last 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, and where we're moving on. So Sandy, did you want to take kind of take this one?
Sure, and this is really, I think, the distillation of all of our points. This is where we really it was almost hard to tell kind of who was the leader in what discipline when the four of us spoke, because there was so much overlap and kind of yaying, as Steve said. So these were sort of the takeaways. Obviously, the whole move from everything being on-prem to not everything in the cloud, but major portions of enterprise content either in the cloud already or rapidly moving there, let alone stuff that's born, raised, and dies in the cloud and never leaves. So we as a group kind of only expect that to continue in 2020. I don't know that any of us is ready to say they'll never be on-prem again, but the tilt towards cloud is quite clear at this point. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go through these. If you guys have major objections or whatever, just jump in. We talked quite a bit actually throughout this webinar already on risk versus value, so I won't spend time there, but it was a kind of a constant theme. Data privacy is clearly here to stay. If you missed the last webinar that Antigone and I did together, we really drove that issue home. And she had a list of all the pending regulation, and we're talking about in the United States now. It was quite amazing to look at that list just to see what's being bandied about. But we all expect data privacy not only to be here to stay as a concept, but to inform business decisions and content management here on out. And what we're really seeing, the next two kind of go together, is getting past the immediate crisis du jour that is forcing, let's say, a legal team or an IT team or an HR department to suddenly grab some technology, use it for the purpose, and then walk away. My background coming from litigation, you see that over and over. It's like a litigation fire drill every time. And just like that is growing up and becoming a process, so too are handling data subject access requests for privacy concerns, handling the onboarding of M&A content, migrating information to the cloud or upgrading systems. We are starting to think in terms of process, and we're starting to think beyond any particular business unit. This is how records does it. This is how legal does it. This is how KM does it. To have this cross-disciplinary, the kind of it takes a village idea that Antigone mentioned. So what we're seeing is that information governance is cross-discipline, beyond crisis. It's just a maturity in managing these types of issues that really brings us to the last one, which is this notion of holistic content management or holistic information governance that's kind of touching everybody, dealing with all the content, and crossing chasms of time and location. Anybody else want to add to that?
You know, we've got a question from the audience here as well. Says, will privacy, quote unquote, become a tool used to argue for non-disclosing information requested?
Yeah, that's, I think what the question is getting at is if there is, let's say, a litigation situation or even a data access request related to one of the privacy regulations, could this interesting question about another's privacy block access to that information. So there are many ways we can unwrap this. I'll just give you a few examples. One of the issues that law enforcement deals with in terms of giving body cam information is they have to go through that process of scrubbing the information that could identify other individuals and making sure that they're not disclosing third-party private information while they're responding to things like a FOIA request. And that's an issue today. In terms of litigation requirements to disclose information, that's one of those things where there's a legal discovery obligation. And so if a party's requesting that disclosure, a company needs to think about whether they're redacting the third-party data that is subject to separate privacy regulations, or if they have to provide that because it's relevant, they're providing it under a protective order. And then, you know, just another example of this is there will be some significant discussion and analysis of the issues around a legal requirement to keep data versus a consumer or a data subject request to delete that data. There's no definition in either law. It's subject to interpretation. So I think there's going to be a lot of activity around this. And I think we're also going to see situations where somebody submits a request, but it's not the requester who's actually the individual, and then the company is tasked with figuring out whether they respond to that request if they have concerns as to whether it's actually the individual who's subject to the request or another party. So yeah, there's many issues to be figured out in the future, and I think all of this tells us that we should be cautious and highly analytical as we think about disclosing personal information in a wide variety of contexts.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We're just coming up to 2 o'clock now, so I think we'll close it out there. If you do have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our 4 panelists today. I'd like to thank you all, Steve, Antigone, Kate, and Sandy, for joining us today and giving us your perspective on your top 5 predictions for 2020 in your areas of expertise. And again, I encourage anyone who's attending, if you'd like to ask these folks some questions, please reach out individually. And also check out our 2019 on-demand webinar series on our website at valoratech.com. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
So is everybody still on?
I didn't know if there was more. If you were going to take us to the woodshed.
No, no, no. I just wondered if our guests are still on, or whether we can do a little debrief. So it doesn't look like we still have Antigone and Sandy. So Steve, what I'm going to do is send a very, very quick Zoom so we can do a quick debrief.
Okay.
All right, I'll do that in a sec.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.